Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Vivian Schiller. I'm Executive Director of Aspen Digital, a program of the Aspen Institute. One of the core tenets of journalism in the modern age is the notion of objectivity. Generations of journalists have been trained to be neutral, that we stand for nothing, lest our readers think we have our thumb on the scale. This often manifests itself into giving both sides a voice, or reporting on the words of powerful figures without opining on their impact or even their veracity. But then came Trump. We had a president who lied from the podium all the time. This is not just my opinion, this is well documented. And then we had a pandemic. And then we had the murder of George Floyd. And then we had January 6th. Worse, we then had the revisionist history of what actually happened on that terrible day. In the face of a tsunami of falsehoods from the Oval Office on down and in state capitals around the country, and as the very viability of democracy is being called into question, these journalistic tenets have been put to the test. How can journalists stand for the truth and stand for democracy without being accused of partisanship, without writing off huge swaths of the audience? That is what we're here to talk about today. Luckily, we have the perfect people to talk about it, and I'm going to just briefly introduce them. Their bios are all incredible, so apologies that I'm shortcutting them. Mitra Kalita has just had an amazing and rich career in journalism. Until recently, she was the head of CNN Digital. She was managing editor for editorial strategy at the LA Times, executive editor at large at Quartz, editor at the Wall Street Journal, founding editor of Mint, a business paper in Delhi, previously worked at the Washington Post, Newsday, the AP, you get the drill. Most recently, she stepped away from big media and has co-founded a new media company called URL Media, a network of brown and Black-owned media organizations across the country. Erin Haynes is editor at large and a founding mother of The 19th, the wonderful The 19th, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. She is also an MSNBC contributor. Prior to joining The 19th, Erin was national writer on race and ethnicity for the AP. She's also been part of the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Orlando Sentinel. Margaret Sullivan is the Washington Post's media columnist. She is the former public editor of the New York Times, the best one in my opinion, and the former chief editor of the Buffalo News, her hometown daily, where she started as a summer intern. She's the author of Ghosting the News, Local Journalism, and the Crisis of American Democracy. Last but not least, Jay Rosen. He has been teaching journalism at NYU since 1986. He's the author of Rethink, which I highly recommend, a blog about journalism. In 2017, he became the director of the Membership Puzzle Project, which studies membership models for sustainability in news. He is an active press critic with a focus on problems in the coverage of politics. And Jay, I introduced you last, but I'm going to start with you. You have been warning us, all of us, on the risks of the view from nowhere in journalism for almost 20 years. I looked it up. That column was in 2003, which I just cannot believe. So what has changed since then? And why is this so damn hard for American journalists?
Well, what's changed is a lot of journalists now recognize that objectivity is to some degree, the way is understood in journalism, a problem. Another thing that has changed is that journalists are now interacting with their audiences, and they can't hide from the kinds of criticism that the audiences have. So that's different. But the main thing that's different is that there's been a breakdown of the underlying system of government and politics that practices in the press rode on. And so the asymmetric polarization we've seen in the country, what's happened to the Democratic Party, and capped by, Donald Trump, has forced people in journalism to ask themselves, what are we doing here? And it's recently forced them to consider whether they ought to become more pro-democracy. The problem, however, is that there's a long tradition in professional journalism in the United States of ignoring your political role. And what we are faced with now is that journalists have to reconsider, redesign the role they're playing in democratic politics. But for decades and decades, what most journalists have said is we don't have a political role. We just tell you what's happening. We don't have a part in the political system. We are just an information source. And it's very difficult to overcome that attitude, even though the evidence for why you should is exploding in front of our faces.
And so how have you seen journalists respond or change, particularly in the last year?
Well, there's a lot more attention to a very important news story, which is the threat to democratic systems from the Stop the Steal movement, from the MAGA movement in general, and from the Trump presidency and the threat of a second Trump presidency. That is now a big story, and it's being reported as a big story. And to some degree, journalists have been able to overcome some of their both sidesism, because there's really nothing like that being done by the Democratic Party. So that's a big deal. But if Trump runs again, which seems likely at this point, as the ABC White House correspondent John Carl has said, nobody really knows in the Washington press how to cover that.
Yeah. Aaron, I'm going to turn to you. You know, one of the challenges I think that a lot of journalists feel is, you know, as Jay pointed out, there is, you know, the Republican Party has changed a lot. There are many more untruths. There's social media, all of that. A lot of the pushback from journalists on trying to sort of stand for democracy, so to speak, is that in doing so and in calling out falsehoods, many of the falsehoods that happen to be on the right, that we're alienating that audience. So, and that we're not, when I say we, I mean, you know, journalists in general are going to basically not reach those people. So what is your response to those who say, well, you know, if you call this out, you're only going to be speaking to the, you know, to one part of the audience?
Well, you know, I think to Jay's point, you cannot both sides something like voting rights and what we're seeing right now in terms of what is happening with what we know is one major party in this country that is very dedicated to the real idea of a rigged election, you know, in elections going forward, the idea that they do want to disenfranchise a significant part of the population, a significant number of our fellow citizens who happen to be minorities, women, and other marginalized groups, right? We know that there is a party that is doing that. We know that there is another party that is trying to push back against that. And so, you know, this is not about anybody's feelings. These are facts. And, you know, in the face of the big lie, as journalists, we absolutely must continue to tell the truth, you know, because the reality is, you know, what has happened in at least the past 4 years, if not longer, is that we have had the erosion of a shared set of facts as a country and a shared sense of what our democracy is and how it should function. And so I think the relationship between the press and this democracy could not have become more clear in our politics. It certainly couldn't have become more clear in terms of local journalism. And I would love to hear Margaret talk some more about that and the importance of that and the cost of the erosion of local journalism in helping to kind of knit that fabric and keep that fabric together for us. Because at the end of the day, you know, and certainly something that we realize at the 19th News is that journalism is about creating community and fostering community. So, you know, we seek to be a home for everybody, whether they want to live there or not. Right. If you want to have this conversation about gender and politics and policy, we invite you in, but also with the understanding that we aren't and can't reach everybody. But that doesn't mean that we don't try. And that doesn't mean that we necessarily give up on our fellow citizens. But again, we cannot continue to both sides things that we know not to be true, because, you know, certainly as a woman and a person of color, I'm well aware that objectivity is a myth that has been a default setting for the people who created it, who were mostly white and mostly male.
Right. There's whenever I hear people talk about sort of the good old days of journalism and Walter Cronkite, you have to question about who was it that was left out of that?
And who was missing? Correct.
Who was missing? Exactly. Margaret, as Erin said, we all want to hear from you about local journalism. And then Mitra, sorry, I'll turn to you as well. You wrote in a recent column, in talking about the catastrophic decline in local reporting, that you say it's not just watchdog journalism that suffers when news organizations shrink or die. The decline affects civic engagement and political polarization too. So say more about that, please.
Yeah, so there have been academic studies done about what happens when local news goes away in a community. And that doesn't necessarily mean it goes away entirely. It doesn't necessarily mean you're in a news desert now, which means there's basically no source of local news. But in a place where local news has, really declined and really withered, which is a lot of places in the United States right now, civic engagement goes down too. People, for example, get less involved in their communities. They get less involved in local politics and government. When they do vote, they vote much more in their, according to their echo chambers. They don't really cross party lines much anymore. They've got their Facebook feed, telling them what to think, and rather than, let's say a newspaper that, however imperfect, and they were and are, nevertheless served a whole community, and you could sort of, talk with your neighbor, whatever your neighbor's politics happen to be, about sort of the basic facts. You might have a different opinion about that. So, it really takes a toll. It's not just like, oh, I don't know what's going on, or gee, maybe my public officials aren't being held to account. It's also that, as Erin put it so well, this sort of knitting together of the community gets, I guess, to stay with the metaphor, very, very frayed. And it's actually very scary. I spend a lot of time in where Jay and I grew up, which is the Buffalo area. I go there in the summer and sometimes at other times a year. And I talk to people a lot about their media habits. And Buffalo still does have a pretty robust newspaper and other sites. But I think that as it declines, I can really see, like, I always used to feel like I could talk to everybody, I just don't feel that anymore. It's really, really sad.
Yeah, and especially because so much of the political action is happening at the local level, it makes it even more of a crisis.
Exactly, and one of the big things that's happening with voting rights and the threats to democracy, those things are happening very much at the state level. So as state coverage declines in many places, state government reporting bureaus, all of that, as that declines, we know less about it and we talk less about it, and it seems like less of an issue, but it's actually more of an issue.
Mitra, I want to pick up the thread that Erin started a couple of minutes ago about why this is particularly concerning when it comes to both serving and telling stories about communities of color, which I know is a great deal of the focus of what you're doing at URL Media. So how has these questions, how are you addressing these questions of, of truth telling and standing for things? I mean, you bring such a long history of sort of traditional journalism. How has that influenced the way that you're approaching your work at URL?
So I think in some ways you have to learn the system in order to break it. And so I'm really grateful for 20 plus years in mainstream media, because a lot of these conversations during the Trump years, where it was absolutely 100% the backdrop of my time at CNN, was kind of this desire to look or stay impartial when it was absolutely impossible. And so what's been really freeing as part of URL Media, and within URL Media, I run a local outlet called Epicenter. We serve the community here in Queens, New York. What's been really freeing is to actually not care as much about public perception in a national, almost anonymous, general sense, but really to say, well, what is in the best interests of our communities? And so URL Media is made up of 10 Black and Brown media outlets that in some ways I think have been the example of how to do this. How do you root journalism in fact, but also center your communities? They all happen to be communities of color, which really help us because there is a target audience, as opposed to the nationalizing of news where you're trying to be for everybody, right? To kind of your point, Vivian, how do you appeal to this guy who, doesn't believe in the vaccine, right? How do you appeal? And so we kind of twist ourselves into knots to get to everybody and in the process actually serve nobody. And so URL, I think, just by centering who are we serving at the core of our journalism and the delivery of information, and in cases like Epicenter, I just had 2,095 masks delivered to my garage yesterday, because when we do community engagement events, we're not just giving out information, we're physically giving you masks. So I would say one area that I'm deeply concerned about going into this year, which is a midterm election, is that the polarization nationally of issues like masks, for example, makes this into are you wearing a mask or not, when actually the nuance within mask wearing requires a certain type of mask that you have to wear in order to be safe. And, if you're an immigrant parent and you're not on Twitter all day and you don't know how to get on the waiting list for the online Korean vendor that's selling KN94 masks that are great for children who are 5 years old. I mean, these are real life situations that are truly life or death as a result of us being kind of in this, are you pro-mask or anti-mask?
Yes.
And so the implications of that for our communities of color that have been so decimated, literally decimated by COVID, I think are pretty dire. And that's kind of my fear going into this year, that we're still in the one side or the other, even on issues, not just parties, and that is not translating into service to our communities.
Yeah. And Vivian, if I could just jump in here on a really important point that Mitra is making about, the role of journalism to really be a resource for communities, right? A resource to citizens so that they can feel empowered, which is certainly something that we're trying to do at the 19th. Doing the kind of both sides of the argument, or really kind of debating the issue, which is a lot of what happens, frankly, in the cable news ecosphere that I operate in as a contributor, and that is certainly an important part. The conversation, the dialogue, the civic engagement, but also, yes, just providing people with information, right? I mean, while we're sitting here talking about, and certainly not encouraging the false threat to election integrity that the Republican Party is using, on the march in state legislatures across this country, not entertaining things like that. But when we're talking about voter suppression versus voter expansion and really trying to get people more access to the ballot, really, I mean, part of that is simply giving people information about precincts that may be closing, voting hours that may have changed that they may not be aware of, how to make sure that they are registered to vote in their community. If they have moved, for example, making sure that they haven't been purged from the rolls. These are the kinds of things that help the electorate be informed and empowered and make them feel, as they're hearing all this noise at this very high level, what they can do as individuals to participate in this democracy. And I think that journalism still has a very important role to play in doing that for those who do want to participate in this democracy, regardless of what their party is, even if they have no party, if they suddenly want to get involved. How do they start? Where do they start? We have a role to play in helping them to do that.
Margaret, that reminds me of something that I've heard you talk about it and write about, which is focus more focus more on the heroes than the villains. There's so much focus, particularly in national media, around the bad, depending on your point of view, the bad guys and girls, and less on who are the heroes of democracy, who are solving problems, as opposed to who's just sowing chaos.
Yeah, it's really a strange thing, but on election night 2016, I was in the Washington Post newsroom, And I had, half written a column about how Hillary was going to treat the press or something as president. And like everyone else, I was like madly throwing out my columns. But I had to write 2 columns that night on deadline. And one of them, maybe I was doing like magical thinking or weird, tuning into something that I didn't even know about. But one of the last lines was, "We're going to need some heroes." And I didn't really even know what I meant when I wrote that. But I think that has come to pass. And we have seen many heroes of our democracy, over the past, whatever it is, 5 years or something, people who have really stood up in the press, but also in government and also in sort of quasi-government roles. The news people tend to write about the negative. It's just like what we do. It's like the plane crashes. We write about that. We don't necessarily write about the reforms happening to airline safety as much as the bad stuff. So I think we need, as we're moving in directions like pro-democracy coverage, we need to be aware not only, I'm not, believe me, not at all suggesting that we don't write about the people who are trying to tear it down, but also, give people some solutions and some inspiration. I think we need it.
All right, so I'm going to take some inspiration from what you just said to talk about the heroes. We do focus a lot, and those of us, media Twitter is a real thing, and we love to dunk on examples of bad behavior in the press. But there are some organizations or cases where organizations are doing it right. Present company accepted, of course. So Jay, who's doing it right? You've been very good on Twitter going, calling out, false equivalencies when those happen all too often. But let's talk about where you've seen some positive movement in journalistic practices.
Well, I think the focus that organizations like ProPublica and others, and Mother Jones and others, have made on the voting story and the threat to voting systems has been exemplary journalism. There's many news organizations involved in tracking that, and we have a good warning from that journalism about what's likely to happen. Also, the people who've been following extreme online movements, and NBC has 2 reporters who are on that beat full time, who actually risk their mental health to go into these worlds and tell us the next crazy thing that's going on there, which is very hazardous work in a lot of ways. Those people are really good, and I think they've done a hell of a lot. And then there's people who have heard this battle cry, you have to become more pro-democracy, and they're starting to take that seriously. I've said many times over the last 6 months or so that journalists have to become more pro-democracy, more pro-truth, pro-evidence, pro-factual basis. And journalists like Jake Tapper have occasionally signed on to that and said openly on air, yeah, I'm going to try and make my program more pro-truth, which might cost me some guests in the future. I think there's something important to that. But a lot of other journalists who hear this message, you have to become more pro-democracy, immediately think, oh, so you want us to be friendlier to Biden, which is missing the point completely. Yeah. And then there's others who hear that and, yeah, it sounds good, pro-democracy, but I worry that we're going to turn off our conservative audiences, or a lot of Republican women watch our show, and so we really can't do that. And that's what brings them back to the both sides. It's not so much that they don't hear this cry, it's that the implications of doing something about it are kind of like too much for them. So they fall back on both sides, even when they don't believe it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're all in it all day, every day, but just the notion that it is controversial to stand for truth and to stand for democracy. Think about it. What's the alternative? If you don't stand for truth and you stand for democracy, you stand for
Both sides.
Exactly. And, Vivian, you're making such a good point because, I think this erosion of truth, there has honestly been a bit of a convergence between facts and feelings that is happening, frankly, in a lot of American households. And some of those households and some of those families include people who are journalists. And, I think that the lesson here is that our lived experience should be an asset to our storytelling, not a liability. This is, again, blowing up the objectivity myth, right? As a Black person in this country, I know what voter suppression looks like. I have family members that have experienced voter suppression. I myself stood in line for 4 hours on election day to cast my ballot, right? So I know what that looks like, and I know what it looks like in the 21st century. I know what it looked like in the 20th century. That is a very real thing that helps me to know what I am looking at, right? As a political journalist who also has experience covering race for the better part of a decade. Similarly, there are white journalists who had people in their families who were certainly a part of this conversation, a part of the evolution of our politics that we've seen in these past several years, who didn't want to think that their aunt, that their uncle, that their grandparents were bad people, right? Even though, they were certainly on board with a lot of what we have seen in these last several years, but that's not the point. The point is to try to get an understanding of where folks are, of who and where we are as a democracy. And we have people in our lives that we can be speaking to get a better understanding of that without making it, it doesn't have to be, such an emotional choice. It's a thing that is informing us as journalists about this electorate, about our society, about our democracy. And so, honestly, I think, we need to be thinking about headed into the next cycle, the midterms, and obviously the next presidential election. We need to be thinking about, who we have on these political journalism teams that are telling these stories. Do they recognize what we are seeing happening in our democracy, and are they prepared to really confront that? And if you've been avoiding these topics at the Thanksgiving table for the past 4 years, you certainly aren't going to be able to do it in the words of your media the spaces of your media organization. So, I think that's it's really important for us to be having this conversation now so that we do not continue to repeat the mistakes that we have been making as a political class, to be able to tell the most honest and accurate story about who and where we are going as a country.
Well, you just teed up my closing lightning round because this went way too fast. There's a lot more to talk about, but I did want to ask each of you to briefly talk about, as we go into a critical election cycle later this year, where a lot of, voting systems and democracy and truth will potentially be put to the test. What is the most important thing that you see either at the national or local level that news organizations need to be doing? Erin, you mentioned about who it is that who do you have around the table? That sounds like maybe more of a television delivery, but I'll just stick with you and then I'll quickly go around to each of the others.
No, I think, every newspaper, whether it's newspapers, radio, television, cable news, everybody needs to think about who they have around the table. But also the other thing that is so important that I think that I'm so proud that we've been able to do at 19th News, centering voters in the conversation. We need to know what voters think and what voters care about and what the issues are that are motivating them to either engage or disengage with this democracy. Hearing directly from them about how our politics and policy is directly impacting their lives is some of the most important work that we can do, not just in the midterms in 2024, but just on an ongoing basis in our political journalism coverage at the national and local level.
Great. Starting with the voice of the voters. Mitra.
I would say I'm going to pick up on a thread Erin mentioned earlier in the conversation on basic information, that I think we have made things very complicated. And so in one of our kind of consternations of how do we reach right-wing voters, and the we becomes, again, the other sides of it all, how do we reach Trump voters? We don't talk about Donald Trump all the time. And so my fear as we're in the midterms, and to Jay's point of he's running again, is that the drumbeat is starting. And I think I can think of no more alienating way to reach a large swath of the US than by kind of beating the same drum versus basic information of how do I vote? Where do I vote? Where do I get an N95 mask? Where do I get an at-home COVID test? To really, and I think national organizations have to play a role in this basic information, because we're literally in life or death times right now. The second piece I would say is rethinking what accountability journalism means. And really, we often treat accountability as a gotcha on the politician versus accountability of government and its delivery of services. I think where our URL members shine is in kind of that extra step they take to ensure that services are meeting the intended users and those in need of them. And I would love to see that to be more of the positioning in terms of evaluating the efficacy of government versus the accountability journalism that we've kind of painted as this person is doing wrong versus these are the people who are being screwed by that.
Great. Thank you, Mitra. Jay.
Well, what I think is most important is for journalists to recognize the certain practices that they have made foundational to their political journalism are broken, and that in a time of emergency for American democracy, they just have to be replaced. I'm talking about such things as horse race journalism, looking at politics through who's ahead, poll-driven coverage, the insider game, treating politics as a game, who's up, who's down, and a whole litany of practices that follow in the wake of those basic themes. They're broken. They don't address our current situation. We can't really afford them anymore. And I would like to see political journalists, especially who are very frustrating to their colleagues. I don't think a lot of people who report on politics understand that it's not just critics like myself, it's their own peers in other beats and other parts of journalism are very frustrated with the political press. So I would like to see a recognition that these practices have kind of done their job. They're out of tune with where we are now. They need to be replaced with better ideas.
Yeah, there's a very, very lucrative subset of news organizations that focus only on the horse race. So not sure. I'm optimistic that's going to change anytime soon. Margaret, we'll let you close us out.
Okay, well, two things, but I'll make it quick. One is that we have to continue to focus on how to support local journalism. And it doesn't have to be newspapers. It's not about the delivery method or whether it's printed or whether it's called the something Guardian. But, in whatever form, we need to do better with that. And there are measures that are out there that I've written a lot about, and I know you guys are all aware of, that need support and they need to happen. So that's a whole session unto itself. But the other thing is, and this picks up on what Jay just said, that kind of scrutiny and soul searching needs to be done at the top levels of newsrooms. Political journalists are not going to be able to change their stripes, I would argue, if their bosses are pretty happy with what they're doing. So I think that the top editors, I don't know that this will happen, but the top editors of our most mainstream news organizations need to look at how their political coverage is being framed for the public. What's coming across? And is this, as Jay says, the most useful? Is it useful? And is it in keeping with today's reality? And as Aaron and Mitra have said, is it in keeping with today's populace and audience? And I think the answer is no, but they need to get serious about it. And I'm not feeling that that's happening in too many places. You see it some places, but not overall. And that's what I would like to see happen.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that all of these things that you all point out are heard, and we will make sure that we try to communicate this far and wide. Mitra, Aaron, Jay, Margaret, thank you so much. What a great conversation. We could have gone on another hour, but so appreciate your time. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.